You know me. I am your daughter, your pastor. You nurtured me, encouraged me, ordained me. For over 20 years, I have served at every governing body level. Yet I cannot tell you my name. For me, the risk is still too great. I work and pray for the day when I am free to say who I truly am.
I often say that I can't tell you when I was called to ministry because I can't remember a time when I wasn't called to ministry. Both of my parents had done lay mission work in the Presbyterian Church for 30 years. They were deeply invested in the church. My parents and grandparents were charter members of the church in West Virginia where I was baptized. Service through the church was their life. It was their life. So I was a part of that. From the day I was born. I knew what a synod was before I was 6 years old. There's a frightening thought. And I was just a part of that life. So ministry in some form or another was something that was always a part of my life from day one.
I went to school at McCormick Seminary and really felt called to rural ministry. That's where my heart is in a lot of ways. When I graduated from McCormick, my first call out of seminary was to a small 3-point parish in rural Missouri, about an hour south of Kansas City. That was my first and last experience in terms of an installed position.
I went to McCormick Seminary in Chicago, started there in the mid-'70s. That was a school that was deeply invested in teaching a very broad range of theology, including feminist theology, liberation and political theology. Social justice was an enormous part of the life of that seminary, and so I took to that like a duck to water. That kind of service wrapped up in a theology of equality and dignity and freedom was exactly where I was. So it was a perfect fit and just strengthened everything I believed about what ministry should be about.
When I graduated from seminary, I was very early in my wondering about my own sexuality. And my thought was, if this is who I am as a lesbian, it won't be a problem because my call is to rural parish ministry and I'll go live out my life in some small rural church and things will be fine.
Tammy was also serving churches in south central Missouri, and my churches were close by, so we had the opportunity to get to know each other a lot better and started dating. Dating was interesting. It was difficult because of our churches in the place that we were living. We could not afford to have anyone even suspicion about us, much less find out about us. So we had a rule that if we were going to go out on a date, if we were going to go to a movie or go out to dinner, that we would go at least 100 miles away. So our dates were long distance, and but we managed, and we actually I moved into the house where she was living in Appleton City, Missouri, a town of 1,000. We just lived a very, very carefully and tightly choreographed life.
Well, what I discovered in that is what an incredible sacrifice that is to your soul. That you share your life in such a profound way with the congregation and with people in the congregation that are going through baptisms, births, deaths, all the significant events of their lives. But you can't share a part of your life. And when I met Martha and we began to develop a relationship and decided to have a holy union and a commitment ceremony, I couldn't share that with anyone in my congregation. I mean, in essence, this is one of the most significant days of my life and I can't share that with anyone.
But it became clear after a while that we just simply couldn't keep this life up. We were going to have to reconcile ourselves to a new way of doing ministry, or getting out of it altogether, or something, because this just was no way to live. It was an oppressive way to live, to have to so carefully guard every word you said, every step you took, when you'd be seen in public and when you wouldn't, and all those kinds of things. So we began to think about what it would be like to come out, to reshape our ministries. To a certain extent, that decision was made for us when the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in 1993 called for a 3-year period of dialogue on the issue of human sexuality. And the church asked for anyone who was gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender who was in a position to do so to come out and tell their stories to the church. The one key piece to that was that the church would not protect our ordinations. So we had to make that decision in the light of day, knowing what it could mean.
It felt like this was the time. We no longer wanted to be closeted, that we wanted to live our lives in a more honest way. And that was a lot of what the decision was about.
And to a certain extent, we did know what that would mean, but we also were unprepared for one very important dynamic, which was that when we signed up to do this work, to tell our stories to churches in our area, we found out that we were 2 of only 3 people in the entire central states that were willing to do this. So we immediately had targets painted on our backs.
We were both working full-time jobs at that point and had pretty much every weekend committed to doing dialogue somewhere in those states. And it just took a huge emotional toll on both of us, as there's only so much you can hear of people's hatred directed towards you, and realize that the church, there is a lot of support within the church, but there's also a lot of homophobia within the institution itself and its people.
From that point on, almost every weekend we were in a different church or presbytery or synod or gathering of some sort in all over the central states, Nebraska, Arkansas, Iowa, Southern Illinois, Kansas, and it was bloody. We had death threats. We had just some of the most obscene insults sent our way in these dialogues. Sometimes we'd be part of a panel, sometimes we would simply be telling our own stories, but people were continually comparing us to people who have sex with animals, or sex addicts, or child molesters, or perverts, or something. Every week it was something like that. And one of our elders in our own presbytery at one point said he would rather take us out in a field and shoot us than to talk to us.
One woman went through this whole list of blaming us why the world is as bad as it is, that we're responsible for the downfall of American society and the war in Bosnia. She somehow lumped all that together. And it's like hearing that time and time again was very difficult, and I don't even know the words to put to it.
We were just beside ourselves. Had never ever dreamed that we would go through something like this, that the church that we had both loved so much and that we had given so much to would treat us like this. Was just beyond us and more than we could bear in some sense. After 2.5 years of these dialogues, I was faced with a rather, as I look at it in hindsight, a rather bizarre choice, which was that I could possibly lose my ordination to inactivity, because in the Reformed faith, ordination and work or vocation are intrinsically linked. And so if you're not working, your ordination can be revoked for inactivity. And here we were doing all this work week after week, and I stood to lose my ordination for not working. I simply couldn't let that happen.
Martha's often said that if she were cut, she bleeds Presbyterian. I mean, her lifeblood has been in the Presbyterian Church, and her family has a long history in the Presbyterian Church. She did not come to this decision lightly. It was one of the most agonizing decisions. It's like being divorced from your family in some respects, because the church had been there for her and had been a part of her faith journey and growth and development as a person.
What we had discovered doing these dialogues was that it was easy for people to dismiss us, to say, well, there's only 3 of you. If we sort of get rid of you, we'll get rid of the problem. And we kept saying, no, that's not the case, because everywhere we went, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender people were coming up to us and talking to us and telling us their secrets and saying, nobody knows, but this is who I am and this is what I'm doing. And we realized we were carrying the stories of literally dozens of people who were closeted that no one else knew about. So we started trying to find ways to tell those stories, in addition to telling our own stories.
And we sat around trying to think of a symbol. And a friend of ours came up with the symbol of a stole. And she said, why don't you ask people to just send you stoles with their stories on? And for those who don't know, stoles are a long band of cloth, which are a symbol that predates Christianity. It was adopted by the Christian church as a symbol of service.
So when it came time to set aside my ordination, I wanted our presbytery to know that it wasn't just us. That if we left, this problem wouldn't just go away. So I went to the General Assembly and I asked people who were friends, who were colleagues in ministry, some of whom had already lost their own ordinations, if they wouldn't send me a stole as a way that we could represent the bigger picture, the numbers of folks who are caught in the same net. And I was really hoping we'd get a couple of dozen stoles to make the point, 6 weeks later, we were overwhelmed because we had received 80 stoles. On the day that I was to set aside my ordination, we hung these 80 stoles up in the church in Kansas City where the presbytery was meeting. And then when it came time for me to make my statement, Tammy and I both stood up together. And I wore the stole that my parents and sister had given me on the day that I was ordained. And after I had said my piece, I took that stole off and just set it down with the others and left. And it was a very symbolic leaving. It was walking away from everything I had ever believed that I would do for the rest of my life. Everything that I was so committed to. And it was over that quick.
We walked off the stage together and out of the room as a symbolic way of saying we're walking out of the active ministry of this church together.
Something was happening here. It was obvious immediately. This is a presbytery that could have discussed these issues intellectually for years. But now they got it on a personal level. They were losing 2 rural pastors, and what would they do? And in fact, that's how they responded to it. They wrote a letter to our General Assembly Council and said, we now have to fill 5 pulpits because of this ban on ordination. What are we going to do? And we realized that we had touched these people on a personal level in the way that we had been so touched by these stoles on a personal level, and something had happened here.
The one thing we hadn't counted on was how you tell people not to send their stoles anymore. Because we saw that as a one-time event, and that we would send back the stoles, and that, thank you very much, it was a wonderful statement, and have a good life. Well, the stoles kept coming.
And suddenly we had 200 of them in our house. Now this was a very small house, so they were everywhere, and they kept coming, and the mailbox would be stuffed with them. Then we'd have letters with them, more letters, 5 and 6 and 7 page letters with people's stories practically from the day they were born, often from people who said they had never come out to anyone before and no one else knew.
Basically, the timing was perfect. It became clear that something had to be done with all these stoles. We often refer to it as a sacred trust, and we had to do something with all those stoles. That it's not just coincidence that they kept coming, that this was serving a very powerful need for people.
So in early 1996, we went to thrift stores and bought suitcases for $5 a piece and packed up those 200 stoles and took them to Rochester, New York for a meeting of Presbyterians for lesbian and gay concerns. It was meeting in a large old church in downtown Rochester. We hung the 200 stoles up on the balcony and around the edges of the church and said, "Look what has happened." And people, I think, were as overwhelmed as we were by that. And clearly it captured people's imaginations, because 7 weeks later, after that meeting, we had 350 stoles. Then we took them to the General Assembly of our Presbyterian Church. We had no display space, so we asked people to be our display space for us. We put them on people's backs, and they wore them all week to restaurants and meetings and on the floor of the assembly, in choir, everywhere. People were wearing these stoles and telling these stories.
People thoroughly loved feeling sort of like they embodied whoever it was that they were wearing at that time. And straight people found out what it was like, in some sense, to be a gay, lesbian, bisexual person, transgender person in the church, because sometimes people would come up to them and assume, because they were wearing a stole, that they were a LGBT person, and treat them in ways that would indicate that. And they said for the first time they embodied what it's like to have that sense of judgment and discrimination directed towards them.
Holding these stoles in our hands was like holding a person's life. And we were aware of holding something sacred, something holy. We had been entrusted with this. And then, as a result, felt called to treat this as the sacred thing that it was, to share it with the church, to treat these people's lives and their stories with the utmost respect, and tell their stories to the world.
This is a wonderful project that I'm so thrilled to be a part of, because this puts names and faces on the issue of ordination of homosexuals in the church. I believe it's easier to call it an issue until you know a gay or a lesbian person, or you're friends with a mother or with a father of a gay or lesbian person. I see people walking through this display, reading these stories of gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender people who have served, who are serving the church as elders, as deacons, as ministers, as missionaries, as church musicians, many of whom cannot sign their name. We have so many anonymous ones because no one can know. And I see people walking through this display and the tears falling, because now it's about these people, and these are their church friends. These are people sitting in the pews with them.
Back when we were doing those dialogues, it was so easy for people to dismiss us as just being 2 or 3. Now we take this display somewhere and people can say, no, this is not just 2 or 3. This is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people and their families who are deeply affected by these issues. And we have been able to do that in areas where it might be hard for people to know someone who's gay because they're closeted.
To me, the Shower of Stoles collection is, above all else, a powerful statement of faith. By the end of 2001, we had close to 900 stoles from 18 denominations. Of the hundreds and hundreds of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people of faith represented in this collection, perhaps only a dozen that I know of have actually left the church altogether. Many still serve their churches of origin in a wide variety of ways. Others have moved on to